What if a racist cop insults a woman at dinner, thinking she's just another target? What happens when, in an instant, his world is turned upside down? He thinks she's someone he can belittle, someone he can easily control. But what happens when he learns who she really is? You won't believe the shock on his face when the truth comes out. How could one woman's identity completely change the course of the evening? Let's dive in. The restaurant hummed with quiet chatter and clinking glasses, its warm lighting casting a soft glow over the tables. It was a place where people came to unwind, to enjoy their meal, and to forget the world outside. But for Officer James Henderson, it was just another opportunity to assert his superiority. James sat at a corner booth, his uniform stiff, and his posture straighter than necessary. He was a cop, a man who had been granted power by his badge and years of service. But more than that, he was a man who believed his authority entitled him to treat others as less than. Across from him sat Michelle, poised and unbothered. She was the picture of grace in her elegant dress, but there was something more powerful about her, something James couldn't quite place. Unlike him, Michelle didn't need to flaunt anything. She carried herself with quiet confidence, a woman who knew her worth even in the face of his condescension. As James made small talk, his words started to slip, insults wrapped in a veneer of politeness. He had no idea who Michelle was, but he wasn't concerned. To him, she was just another woman who didn't belong in a place like this. He figured he could push a little, until he realized he'd made the worst mistake of his life. The dinner was supposed to be a peaceful escape, but things began to shift as soon as James opened his mouth. At first, it was subtle, just a comment about the restaurant's decor, the kind of casual remark anyone could make. But soon, his tone changed, and Michelle could feel the weight of his words pressing in on her. He casually mentioned the growing number of people like her at high-end places like this, his voice dripping with judgment. Michelle, who had been quietly savoring her meal, paused. The air seemed to thicken. She raised an eyebrow, not saying anything at first, trying to gauge whether she was reading the situation wrong. But James didn't let it go. He pressed on, unaware of the tension growing around the table. "You know," he continued, his words slow and deliberate, "some people just don't appreciate the finer things. They get let in everywhere, but what do they really contribute? Just another face in the crowd." His smirk was evident as he looked at her, fully confident in his superiority. Michelle could feel her heartbeat pick up, but she didn't flinch. Her hands were steady, her face calm. She had encountered this type before. The question was, how much would she take before addressing it? As the conversation continued, his jabs became sharper. He made snide remarks about the type of people who didn't belong in restaurants like this, clearly speaking about her in a way he thought was casual but was anything but. She could have reacted in any number of ways, angry, upset, or defensive, but Michelle didn't want to give him the satisfaction. Instead, she took a slow breath, looking him straight in the eye. The silence between them stretched on, and James, believing his words were harmless, kept going. "Must be nice to be handed everything on a silver platter," he sneered. "What's it like, living with that constant chip on your shoulder, thinking you're owed something?" That was it. Michelle wasn't going to let this man keep running his mouth. It wasn't just about her. It was about anyone who'd ever been subjected to the kind of casual racism that people like James thought they could get away with. But what happened next would surprise him, and everyone else around. Michelle set her fork down with deliberate slowness, her voice calm but sharp when she finally spoke. "I don't think you realize who you're speaking to," she said, her words cutting through the tension like a knife. She leaned in slightly, her eyes locking with his, and for the first time, he felt a small chill run through him. "You've made some assumptions that are about to cost you." James, for a moment, didn't know how to respond. He looked at her with a smug smile, clearly underestimating her. "Oh, yeah? What's that supposed to mean?" he scoffed. "You'll find out," Michelle replied, her tone unwavering. A few seconds passed, and then the unexpected happened. The waitress, who'd been silently observing the whole exchange from a distance, walked over to the table with a small booklet in her hand. She paused, glanced at Michelle, and then turned her eyes to James. "Sir, I believe you're misunderstanding who you're speaking to," the waitress said, her voice firm. James looked puzzled. "What? What are you talking about?" Before anyone could say more, the waitress opened the booklet and handed it to James. He looked at it, confused, until the words began to sink in. It was an official ID, a government-issued identification card, confirming that Michelle wasn't just any woman dining at a restaurant. She wasn't just someone who could be insulted or belittled. No, Michelle was someone with incredible influence. Michelle was a top advisor, an official in the government, and someone who had dedicated years to fighting inequality and injustice. She held positions of power and respect that James could never have imagined. The shock hit him like a freight train. His smirk faltered, and his face drained of color as the truth about who Michelle really was hit him all at once. He stammered, words catching in his throat as he tried to backtrack. I didn't know," he muttered, completely rattled. But Michelle didn't give him the chance to apologize or justify his actions. She simply stood up, her posture even more commanding now that the truth was out in the open. "It's a little late for that," she said coldly. "But you'll learn something tonight, Officer Henderson. You can't look down on people just because you think they're beneath you. We all deserve respect." She turned to leave, the weight of the moment hanging in the air. James sat frozen, unable to speak, his mind racing as the reality of what had just happened settled in. The words he had spoken carelessly, the insults he thought were harmless, now felt like they had the power to destroy everything he had worked for. As the minutes passed, the restaurant seemed to slow down. It was like the entire room held its breath, watching as James sat there, paralyzed. He still couldn't quite grasp what was happening. He was the one with the power, right? He was the cop. He should have been the one in control. But as he stared at Michelle, her calm confidence only seemed to grow, and his nerves started to unravel. "You didn't think I'd say something, did you?" Michelle said, breaking the silence, her voice still smooth, but now cutting through the tension like a blade. Her words weren't angry. They didn't need to be. There was something more powerful in her quiet strength. "You think, because you wear a badge, you can talk down to anyone, but you're wrong." James tried to collect himself. His usual cocky demeanor was gone, replaced by discomfort. He'd expected a confrontation, some defensiveness maybe, but not this. This wasn't just any woman he could dismiss. She wasn't rattling, wasn't even flinching. She was watching him, measuring his every movement. "Look, I didn't mean it like that," he said, stammering. I didn't know who you were, all right?" I thought, but Michelle cut him off, not allowing him to finish. "You didn't have to know who I was. The fact that you thought you could say those things to me without knowing anything about me is the problem." She leaned forward, not in anger, but in control. Your ignorance isn't an excuse for disrespect, especially not in my presence. James' face reddened. He could feel his entire reputation, his authority, slipping away. He tried to muster an apology, but the words got stuck. How could he apologize when he had no idea how deep his actions went? Apologies wouldn't undo what he'd said. He had insulted her, underestimated her, and now he was paying the price. "I was wrong," he muttered finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean it. Really." But Michelle wasn't listening to his apology. She didn't need it. She wasn't seeking an apology. What she needed was for him and everyone around him to understand the real cost of his ignorance. She knew that an apology wasn't enough to fix the harm done, not when the root of the problem was deeper than a single insult. "No," she said simply, looking him directly in the eyes. "You don't get to apologize your way out of this. You don't get to pretend this didn't matter. People like you think that because you have power, you can say whatever you want to others, but you need to realize something." Her voice grew stronger. "Words matter, especially coming from someone in your position." The rest of the restaurant seemed to go silent as the weight of Michelle's words hit James. The room wasn't just watching. They were waiting. He could feel the eyes of the diners, the staff, everyone on him. He was no longer just a cop in a restaurant. He was a man who had been caught in his own arrogance. The public had seen him fail in real time, and they weren't going to forget it. "Do you even understand the power you have?" Michelle continued, her voice steady. "You could have ruined my night, my peace, and the peace of everyone else in here with your words. You think a uniform gives you the right to act like that, but it doesn't. Power is not the same as respect." James wanted to say more. He wanted to tell her that he was just a guy doing his job, but he couldn't. The weight of her words was too much. His actions had come back to haunt him, and now he had to sit in the uncomfortable silence of his mistake. For a man who was used to being in control, this moment was a complete unraveling of everything he thought he knew about power and authority. Michelle stood up slowly, not giving him a chance to speak again. "I'll leave now. But remember this, Officer Henderson. You don't get to treat people however you want just because you think you're untouchable. The truth always has a way of finding you, and you just learned that." As she turned to walk away, James remained frozen in his seat, unable to even offer the apology that was on the tip of his tongue. She had walked away from him, not as a victim, but as a force to be reckoned with. And as Michelle left the restaurant, the truth about who she was and what he had just witnessed hung in the air, a lesson he would never forget. James couldn't shake Michelle's words. Her calmness in the face of his insults had unsettled him. She wasn't rattled, didn't back down or get defensive. Instead, she'd exposed his arrogance with nothing more than a few pointed remarks. And now he was left wondering who she really was. As the waitress had handed him Michelle's ID, his mind had skipped over it in his panic. But now he couldn't ignore it anymore. "You'll be seeing her again," the waitress had said with a knowing look. What did that mean? It was then that James started to connect the dots. He pulled out his phone, trembling slightly, and searched Michelle's name. What popped up left him speechless. He had no idea who he'd been insulting. The article he clicked on confirmed it. Michelle Harris, a leading force in social justice. Michelle wasn't just a regular person. She had been involved in high-profile social justice reforms, uncovering corruption at the highest levels. She had been instrumental in a legal battle that dismantled a corrupt political system. She was more than just influential. She was a hero to many. The weight of the revelation hit him all at once. This wasn't some random woman he could belittle. He had just insulted a powerhouse, someone who had risked everything to make real change, and he had no idea. James stared at the screen, completely dumbfounded. He could feel his chest tighten, his breath quickening. How had he not known? He had been so sure of his superiority, so sure that his badge made him untouchable. And yet, here was Michelle, calm, collected, and not who he thought she was at all. But it wasn't just her accomplishments that had him reeling. It was the way she'd handled the situation. She hadn't argued, hadn't fought back in the way he expected. She had exposed his ignorance with the most devastating weapon, silence and truth. He realized that her power didn't come from a badge or a title. It came from her conviction, her ability to stand in her truth and make him confront his own weaknesses. As the gravity of his mistake settled in, James felt a cold sweat break out. He had just ruined any chance of regaining his self-respect. But even worse, Michelle's influence wasn't just personal. It was widespread. His mind raced, thinking of the consequences. His actions were public now. He had offended someone whose reach extended beyond what he could have imagined, and the world would soon know about it. James' panic grew as he realized this wasn't just a single embarrassing moment in a restaurant. This would follow him. The truth about Michelle was now out there, and his reputation would never be the same. Michelle wasn't just a victim of his prejudice. She was a force that had dismantled him, layer by layer, with every word he had said. And, as she had walked away, he knew her identity was just the beginning of his downfall. James had underestimated her completely. He had thought he could insult her without repercussions, thinking she was just another person who wouldn't fight back. But Michelle wasn't like the others. She was more than capable of holding her own, and now he knew the kind of power she wielded. He sank back into his chair, his mind still reeling. How could he fix this? Was there even a way to redeem himself after what he had done? The reality of it hit him hard. Michelle didn't need an apology. She had already won, and he was left to deal with the consequences of his arrogance. The days after that dinner felt like a blur for James. His mind kept returning to Michelle's words, the calmness in her voice, the way she had exposed him without raising her voice. At first, he tried to brush it off, thinking it was just a one-time confrontation, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized how deep his mistake ran. James had assumed Michelle was just another person he could push around, someone who wouldn't fight back. But she wasn't just anyone. She was a symbol of everything he had overlooked, everything he had been taught to ignore. Her identity wasn't just a shock. It was a revelation. Michelle had dismantled the walls he had built around himself. He had assumed he was better, that his badge made him untouchable. But Michelle was someone who had spent her life fighting for others, and her actions forced him to see how deeply ingrained his prejudices were. He had been wrong, and now it was impossible to deny. As the days passed, James couldn't look at himself the same way. Every interaction, every encounter felt different. His eyes were finally open to the systemic problems that existed all around him. The badge that once symbolized authority now seemed like a hollow representation of privilege he had taken for granted. Michelle hadn't just taught him about his own failings. She had forced him to confront the bigger picture. He realized that it wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had ever faced the prejudice he had displayed. Michelle had done something far more powerful than defend herself. She had exposed the inequalities in the system he had spent his whole life supporting. The guilt and shame were heavy, but James knew there was no turning back. The way he had lived his life, how he had treated people, how he had let his position define him, was no longer an option. Michelle's silence had said everything he needed to hear. She didn't need to explain herself. She didn't need to demand an apology. She had stood in her truth, and that had been enough to strip him of his ignorance. Michelle's identity was just the tip of the iceberg. What really struck James was the realization that he had been so blinded by his own power that he couldn't see the larger impact of his actions. He had dismissed someone who could have been an ally, someone who was out there, changing the world for the better, while he stayed in his bubble of privilege. As the days wore on, James started to rethink everything: the job he thought defined him, the people he'd surrounded himself with, the choices he'd made. He realized that it wasn't enough to recognize that he had done wrong. It wasn't enough to feel guilty. He had to act on it. He had to change. James knew that this wasn't the end of his journey. It was just the beginning. He could no longer walk through life with his eyes closed. Michelle had shown him the kind of strength that came from standing up for what's right. Now, he had to find the courage to stand up for it too, to hold himself accountable for the damage he had done, not just in this moment, but in every other moment of his life. But Michelle wasn't just an example of courage. She was a wake-up call to everyone who had ever felt the sting of racism, to every person who had been dismissed or overlooked. Her grace in the face of his insults had dismantled everything James thought he knew about power. James couldn't undo what had happened, but he could work to do better. He could listen. He could learn. And most importantly, he could fight for the change Michelle had shown him was possible. He didn't need to be a hero to make a difference. He needed to be willing to change the way he saw the world. James had never felt the weight of his actions like this before. The realization that he had crossed a line, not just with Michelle, but with everything he thought he knew, was like a punch to the gut. He had been given a second chance, not just to apologize, but to change. But change takes time, and it takes effort. The question now was, what was he going to do with the truth he had learned? Michelle had exposed something far deeper than his own ignorance. She had shown him the cracks in the system, cracks he had been blind to for so long. And now the world was watching. He couldn't undo what he had done, but he could do better. He could make sure he wasn't part of the problem anymore. But the truth didn't stop with him. It had to ripple out, making others stop and think. We all have moments when we realize we've been wrong. But the question is, how do we react? Do we let our mistakes define us, or do we learn from them and work to be better? James had a long road ahead of him, but so did all of us. Whether it's recognizing our biases or standing up for what's right, it starts with taking responsibility and making the conscious choice to change. I want to know your thoughts. Have you ever had a moment where you realized you were wrong? How did you handle it? Drop a comment below, and let's talk about how we can all learn, grow, and become better versions of ourselves. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear this message. Together, we can create a ripple of change.